Okay, good morning. This is Richard Hsu. This morning, I'm really pleased to have with me as my guest Carla Swansburg, who's the current CEO at ClearyX, also a former practicing lawyer herself. Carla, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
So, Carla, I saw a wonderful article about ClearyX. I believe it was on the American Lawyer. And so I reached out to you and I wanted to learn more about what ClearyX is and also how this opportunity or how you found this opportunity, or maybe how the opportunity found you.
It was a little bit of both, I would say. But let me start with the sort of what we call the origin story, because I think it is a little bit unique. We don't see a lot of replication of this exact model yet. I'm sure we will.
Yeah.
But the firm decided, it kind of predates me. So I always say I can't really take credit for that kind of vision. But a few years before hiring me, the firm realized technology is creeping in, I always say it creeps up the value chain. If you look at something like e-discovery, legal research, that, the completely technologically automated and there's no going back. But I think the firm realized there's more and there's more coming. They also realized they were struggling a little bit, as many big firms do, to kind of turn the ship around, implement changes. So their decision was, why don't we figure out what will disrupt our business? What kind of business is most likely to disrupt some of our practice? And then let's build that.
Huh.
So our core function is to figure out how to disrupt big law in new
Wow.
ways, which is kind of
Wow.
fun, kind of
Yeah,
cool.
interesting. And
Yeah.
they felt like they couldn't do that within Cleary. They wanted to set up a separate organization. Tell
A
me a little bit
separate
about that.
organization, and actually that's something that I feel very strongly about. And when they first reached out to me through a recruiter, they wanted someone in New York or London, and I had just built a house in Nova Scotia, which is where I'm from, and there was no way I was moving. So, sort of fast forward, we are fully remote. But the thinking was, there are so many constraints. I'm sure you are familiar with them and have heard about them. Trying to make change within a big law firm.
Mhm.
You've heard the analogies about trying to turn a ship around. I always like to say it's like you're living in a kind of house, or you're working in a factory and you're cranking out product. And to renovate a piece of that is disruptive, right? To drop in a brand new piece of something within a
Yeah.
busy,
Yeah.
successful, thriving organization is really disruptive, upstream, downstream. So if you had the luxury of taking some space next door and starting from scratch and building from the foundation up with all the new shiny tools and new, the kind of whatever's available on the market, that's essentially what they're doing. So
Yeah.
we don't have to worry about legacy technologies, about billing models, about hiring models. There's sort of no inherent conflict between how we do things and how the firm does things, because you break everything
Yeah.
from the pricing models to how you record time when you kind of set up a whole new business.
Huh.
So we have the agility and the flexibility and the space for experimentation that a big firm just doesn't have the luxury
Huh.
of
Interesting.
doing.
Interesting.
So that's kind of the basics, but it does give us a whole lot more freedom, even from a risk management perspective, like you name it, all the
Right.
infrastructure
Right.
reasons why it's hard to make those changes. We
Yeah.
don't have to worry about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Well, what did convince you to join this organization? What was about it that seemed exciting?
Well, I didn't, to be completely honest, as a Canadian lawyer, my entire career has been in Canada. Although I've worked in different models, worn different hats, been in-house, worked at Epic, which is another big alternative provider. When they reached out to me, the truth is, if I had sat back and said, well, what I really like to do when I grow up, if that ever happens,
Mm.
it would be this. It would be having that freedom to look at the sort of scope of legal services and say, what pieces of this could be done better? What are the problems that nobody's solving?
Mm.
And how can we bring new models and technology to bear on that? I did a lot of this work when I was in practices when I was the chief innovation officer at a Canadian firm. And it's really hard. It's like you're pushing the boulder uphill, and while people are cheering you on, they're not pushing that boulder with you. They're kind of keeping a safe distance.
Mm.
So the ability to have that freedom, and I was very, maybe strident is not quite the right word, but I was adamant about how I would approach building a business like this, how it would be client facing, how it would be, have that room to experiment, how hiring different kinds of resources, not doing hourly billing unless we were forced to at gunpoint. So all of those things to me is, I'm 3 years in and I'm super excited still about the opportunity to do that. So for me, it was, once they agreed that I could do it from my home in the middle of nowhere in Nova Scotia, it was kind of a no-brainer. And one of the things I love to do is build a team. I always say my only superpower needs to be that I hire well, which you will appreciate given your business,
Yeah.
and surround myself with people who know better than I do about all the things that I don't know as much about, and just create that sort of dynamic of people who are excited about change, thrilled to solve problems, willing to rethink constantly and have the resilience to say, okay, that wasn't perfect. Let's keep iterating on that process. So that's what I've been doing since
Interesting.
September 2021.
Now, I'm sure there's a lot of secret things you're working on, but can you say what are some of the things you've
Sure.
done so far that have disrupted the legal
Absolutely.
industry? Or
It's it's like incremental disruption. But
yeah,
we
yeah.
started, and the mandate from the firm was that freedom and flexibility, but job number one was due diligence.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways it's analogous, a little bit different, but to e-discovery, right? There's sort of repetitive processes, there's a lot of contract review, a lot of volume, and it costs a ton. So we set out to sort of reinvent how we conduct due diligence. So obviously a lot more technology and AI being deployed, but we've kind of revamped everything. I've always thought that the output from due diligence, which is often an Excel spreadsheet with a summary of every change, like
Yeah, yeah.
nobody reads that, and it's not useful, actionable information. So we can create the same kinds of output that traditionally associates do, but we have a team that's done over 80 deals. So they're just really good at it. No junior associates have done that many deals. But the other thing we've been able to do is kind of look upstream and downstream. So you have a virtual deal room. We can, using AI and some other secret sauce, we can create visualizations and dashboards of heat maps of key contracts where people can sort of see, which ones have the most troubling provisions. How do we kind of triage the review? And then at the back end, again, looking at problems that weren't being solved, people who buy a business, someone then has to integrate that business, right? Someone has to figure out, what did we buy? What contracts do we have? So we've built kind of post-closing integration portals where the business people can have visibility over their contracts, can have AI extracted deadlines, renewal dates, all the sort of information that they need to have to be able to integrate that business. So we've just kind of looked at it from the beginning to end, applied a ton of process discipline, tech wherever we can. And we've been constantly experimenting with new versions of generative AI, for example,
Yeah,
to see
right,
how we
right.
can implement that. So that was number one. The other piece I would say is kind of a legal operations piece, which is much more client solution focused. And that involves things you'd expect, like contract management, document automation, sort of data analytics portals. And I'll give you a recent example that we just started publicizing. The EU now has requirements for certain companies to kind of collect global information on subsidiaries and report based on thresholds. So we've just built an elegant solution where clients can collect that information in the same place. You get some nice things like currencies that are harmonized automatically in the back end. And we're working on a solution where you can kind of automate through the push of a button the report that you need to file with the European Union. So again, it's something people were using spreadsheets and Word documents and trying to wrangle information and data. So just putting together a solution that makes somebody's life easier. So they're not, it's not like major transformative rocket science.
Yeah.
It's just solving problems that people constantly identify to us that we feel like we have the right tools and resources to be able to solve. Part of the value we bring, because we're owned by the law firm and we don't have any outside investment, although we're setting ourselves up so that that's a possibility because we're not a law firm, is that the part of our value is just extending and building on relationships with clients and trying to solve more of their problems. I've always thought law firms were not as good as the big four, for example, at solving a broader spectrum of their clients' problems. It's also often transactional, and clients will often complain that their relationships with their law firms are pretty transactional.
Right.
So we create subscription and managed services products that kind of extend that relationship and are a little bit stickier.
So tell me, it sounds like you're using a lot of third-party technology, but then you're also creating some of your own. Give me a little bit feel for the mix of that.
Sure. We started off saying, well, we don't need to develop proprietary software. There's enough people doing that.
Right.
And looking at third-party platforms that were sort of in market, mature, secure, and weaving them together, building some of our own APIs and some custom development on top of them. But we've reached the kind of outer edges of our ability to do that. And even just something like users, if we have tools that we need hundreds of people to access. So we kind of pivoted, not really pivoted, but kind of developed, expanded our strategy and brought in our first software engineer fairly recently and are starting to build some customized solutions. I think it also takes what we're good at and what we're able to do and kind of increases the sort of value that we can provide to clients, because we can say, oh, we can integrate that, or we can develop these, whether it's something like the currency conversion or the automated reporting, we can add a whole lot of value so that when the client says, this contract management tool is great, but I wish I could do X, we have the ability to figure out, well, maybe we can actually build X if it's something that's scalable and that we think there's a big demand for. So we're adding the ability to do custom development. Of course, it creates, so many more issues around info security and so forth, but we figure we're at an age and stage of our development where we're ready for that.
Oh, I see. Interesting. So if so the bulk of the people at ClearyX are not technologists. Are they former lawyers, or what is kind of their
It's
background?
over half are former lawyers, and
Okay.
we, they're lawyers. They're what do you call them? Former lawyers. We just, we do have that line that we draw where we'd have so many unauthorized practice issues if we were technically
Yeah, of
practicing
course.
law. So we kind of, much like the e-discovery companies and other ALSPs, we're not a law firm. We're sort of a
Yeah.
business, but we have a lot of former lawyers. We have technologists, project managers. We have one designer who's kind of focused on user experience and design. We just hired our first marketing person and then our first software person.
Yeah.
So the bulk of our hiring now is not people who are legally trained, but people who can build solutions and maintain them. But having not just our own kind of legally trained team, but having access to the firm, right? Where global and all these experts who can really identify on the front lines some of these use cases for us. It's been hugely valuable. And it's like a pipeline. The I know lawyers don't like to talk about the S word, the sales word. They don't do that. But the reality is our best sales force and champions are the partners who are constantly referring us to clients and setting up conversations.
Perfectly. Yeah.
Mhm.
Is the ultimate goal of the company to provide these services to other law firms and non-Cleary clients, or?
Non-Cleary clients, yes. In fact, we already were just working out commercial terms with a couple of clients who are not clients of the firm. And that's another one of the differentiators. That's rare, I think, that law firms say, go to it. And so that's why we hired our own marketing person. So we engage with people who aren't clients. They may become clients of the firm, you never know. But other law firms, yes. And I can see some use cases for, mid-tier firms who want to be able to kind of do larger projects. But I think there's always going to be a barrier, whether, psychological or not, to other competing large law firms using something that's Cleary branded. And we're okay with that because we like to engage directly with the clients and the in-house counsel and legal operations people.
What are some of kind of the longer vision things that you hope to be able to do, maybe in a more abstract form? If you haven't fleshed out the details, I'm kind of curious, like what do you see in the being able to do in the, say, 5 or even 10-year time horizon?
So a couple of things. I talked about sort of the incremental stuff, the solving the small problems, but ultimately we have some much bigger goals, as you can imagine, to be a little bit more transformative. And there are a couple of areas where we think that could sell side deals are one where a ton of people, spend a ton of money on documentation, and only one winner emerges in a bidding war, for example. So we see all kinds of ways to turn that into a sort of managed service almost, or a platform where, starting with clients who have enough market power to say to potential bidders, here's the platform, here are the parameters, here are the variables you can choose from. NDA management, there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into sell side deals that people spend a lot of money on that's kind of wasted is the wrong word, but not productive. So we have, this vision that piece by piece, we'll figure out how to transform some of that work. Private equity clients is another one, sort of the management of whether it's their or side letters and there's constant pain points. There's a couple of platforms that sort of touch on that, but that's another area that we think is ripe for sort of the ultimate big transformation. The way we like to approach it, though, is that kind of pick off a problem that we can solve and then just expand, right? Upstream and downstream so that you get it right. One of the things that we do a lot is build with clients, because I've seen firsthand there's a lot of assumptions made about how they work and how we'll use it back end. So that's kind of how we approach it. It's a little bit different than just building a solution and trying to sell it to people. So that's how we're working on these bigger problems.
Yeah, interesting. Now, all the examples you've given so far sounds like they're in the transactional space. What about in litigation? Do you see yourselves transforming that space as well?
Yes and no. The firm has a really good e-discovery business. So there's a discovery litigation technology that's quite mature, that's quite successful. So we model ourselves a little bit on that. There are some areas that are a little bit outside of that. We're doing some data management for a class action, for example. Sometimes there's sort of more exercises more akin to diligence, so we will take that on. So We've started with the transactional work, but some of our expertise and resources can be applied equally to projects within that space, but not e-discovery just because that's already solved for.
Yeah, yeah. Now, are there any of the law firms who've set up such a regime, a separate company to do this kind of thing that you're aware of?
We say no. And, you look at, there are some models like Wilson Sonsini 650 that's sort of a tech developer, A&O's Aosphere, although they've kind of spun that off. And some of them, like the A&O model, are kind of the productization of legal advice, right? So they're charging a fee for essentially packaging up legal services and templates. Cooley Go is another one where you can kind of pay for a template. But what we are putting together, we say it's like an amalgam of consulting, technology solutions, and the services that we wrap around it. So surprisingly, we haven't really seen, you look at businesses like Elevate, for example, that does a little bit of that, but they're also a law firm. So it's really a combination of all of those models, and we haven't really seen a lot of copycats just yet. And I think part of that is courage, right? The idea that you're giving some power and latitude to a separate business to kind of operate as a business as opposed to a law firm. And I think a lot of firms seem to lack the courage to just let that happen. So
What is kind of the market's reaction when they hear about a company that's, part of a law firm? I guess you're not hiding that you branded Cleary.
Yeah.
What is their response? Are they skeptical, or do they think, oh wow, this is really interesting? What is kind of the market response?
So initially there was some skepticism. There was some, well, this is just going to be like all the other captives that are very focused on internal process improvement and practice support. Clients have been universally thrilled to say to them, we will provide some work that's the quality and kind of backed by the Cleary brand, but at, 30 to 60% off for deal work or whatever it is. And just the notion of trying to solve some of the problems that no one's solving for them at a price point that makes sense has been universally welcomed. I think there's a lot of firms looking at this and trying to kind of scratch their heads and say, well, is it different? Is it really any different? We actually were, and we've not been shy about talking about this either, last year, which was our second full year in business, we actually were profitable. So we collected more revenue than it cost us to run the business. So I think, to me, that sort of says, well, see, there's some viability here. And it's not, again, the firm wasn't focused on revenue as a priority because, it'd be a rounding error in a Wall Street Am Law 30. But it means you're not a cost center, which is very different from how you're positioned if you're practice support, for example. So I think we'll see more, but we'd like to think we've gotten a bit of a head start and built something a bit unique.
Did the origin of this idea was it started kind of within the firm and then it was spun out, or was just entirely started as a completely new idea and nobody was even trying this within the firm?
I think it came from the leadership of the firm and the managing partner, Michael Gersensang in particular. And he kind of pinpoints many roads lead back to Richard Susskind, right? He pinpoints a conversation probably 4 or 5 years ago with Richard Susskind, where he kind of thought, we should probably really get on this. And I think, growing up in the Canadian legal market, there were a lot more cost pressures a lot sooner. So using a Kira or a diligence as sort of a machine learning tool for diligence became table stakes and a market requirement way sooner. The Wall Street firms have been largely unaffected, if I can say that, by a lot of that kind of client pressure. And I think it just started, maybe post-financial crisis, maybe even more recently, where some of the clients were looking at things like disaggregating. So I think the combination of, the beginnings of some of that pressure and conversations around fee arrangements, and a conversation with Richard Susskind, I think the firm just thought, well, how are we going to do this? And I'm not sure Cleary was, keeping up, if we could say that, with some of the other firms in their tech enablement. So I think they just thought, well, let's just skip ahead and let's just, invest in this. And, it's a long-term plan. It's not, it's not like there's a sort of PR announcement and then off you go. The firm is very supportive and engaged and committed. And we're growing and
interesting. And Richard, I know Richard Susskind well. He's been a guest on my podcast a couple of times. Is he an advisor to the company or anything like that?
He is not. No. Although we've been in touch a few times, and page 99 of his latest version of Tomorrow's Lawyers, you'll find a reference to Cleary. So that was my big win. But yeah, I think he just, he's sort of out there with his views in the market, and and I think he was a catalyst for a lot of law firm leadership starting to really
Yeah,
take these
yeah,
things
yeah,
seriously. So I think he's part of that origin story. And as I said, I was just brought in to, to implement
yeah, yeah,
the vision.
yeah.
So
Well, other than the fact that you could live in Nova Scotia and do this job, putting that aside, what was about it that made it exciting? I mean, it seems like it's also scary and exciting at the same time. Was it the entrepreneurial itch that you were trying to scratch, or tell me a little bit about what you saw as the
yeah.
real appeal for this for you?
It was a little bit of that, but it was also the fact that, especially when I was in-house, but also when I was an innovation officer, I used to see tons of potential to solve these problems. And,
Mhm.
just to give you one sort of very small example, very large multinational client was looking for help automating employment contracts. And the firm at the time was kind of like, it's not really part of our business model, and to try and figure out how to do that. And I thought I was always frustrated by that lack of flexibility. I
Mhm.
also was always kind of frustrated by the billing models and the hourly rates. I think when you spent many years as an in-house person, you get that sense. So for me, the ability to kind of weave together my own experiences, so private practice, in-house, ALSP, innovation leader, and be empowered to figure out how to do it from scratch and sort of, shake off the shackles, as I say, of all of the constraints that I've experienced in the past was really too good to turn down. And I had a couple of conversations with former colleagues where I would say to them, this feels different. And
Mhm.
they'd be like, yeah, sure, another big law firm. How can it be different? And you ask any of them and they will say, no, it really is.
Mhm.
And they sound like, to those not necessarily as familiar with it, it sounds like not a big deal to say we can bill however we want, we can record time however we want, we can hire, the resources that we need wherever they are. But those things are disruptive within a large law firm, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
So even just the fully remote thing, most law firms are requiring people to show up a few days
Yeah,
a week.
definitely.
So,
Yeah.
and we can hire, the not having real estate is huge, but we can hire people, and I have people all across Canada and the US, the UK, Scotland. So it just gives you that freedom and flexibility. So to me, it was just a really exciting opportunity to have the backing of, a first-class global law firm, but to be entrepreneurial and cobble together solutions and build new things and figure out how to do that in a safe space and experiment and have the risk framework to be able to say, okay, well, that tool didn't work or that project didn't work, and just move on without having to worry about dragging down
Mhm.
the partners.
So
So
if you look ahead 10 years from now, uh, how would you define, like, is there a metric that you would say, I can look back and say, this was definitely a success? In other words, would it be a certain amount of revenue? Would it be a certain number of customers? Would it be ClearyX going public? I mean, what would you, what would have to happen in 10
I don't
years that
think
you
it's
would
that,
say,
but I think,
hey,
and we
this was a
do, yeah,
success?
that's right. And it's a bit of a moving target, to be perfectly fair. Um, we want to be able to have, we definitely want to be global.
Uh-huh.
We definitely want to grow our team in other markets. Those are sort of pretty simple markers of success. We do have some revenue targets.
Uh-huh.
We also are working on sort of, we're quite embedded in the firm in terms of borrowing their systems and infrastructure and them funding our obligations and collecting. We want to be financially independent. So,
Yeah.
what does that look like? Well, we're generating a profit, but we're not necessarily managing the capital in that sense. Um, I don't, we have set ourselves up so that we could take outside investment, and we go back and forth on that one. Right now, not having the constraints of an investor who has certain expectations has
Yeah.
been fantastic. So I don't think that's part of it, but essentially being a market leader in transforming legal services, kind of a hallmark for us. Um, and yeah, being a profitable, large, thriving business. We joke internally about when we will overtake the firm and, when they'll report to us. But the reality is, part of our objective is to kind of transform in a way that's likely to affect things like the leverage model
Yeah.
at the law firm, right? So in some ways, our success involves wholesale moving aspects of practice into these entirely new models. So
Yeah.
continuing to renovate and grow our house and factory, and having the firm sort of shift and change a little bit within that. So it's a moving target, but we do have big goals in these transformative projects where we'd love to be the sort of market leader in how these transactions are managed and operated, and to keep that competitive moat for as long as possible.
Well, Carla, this has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate your taking the time. Congratulations on all your success, and thanks for sharing it with me.
Thank you. I'm always happy to chat about it, and thank you for having me.
This is Richard Hsu and Carla Swansburg. Thanks.